Over the last few videos, we've talked about alignment, integrity, and learning to trust yourself again. And if you've been sitting with those ideas, another question naturally starts to appear. If I can trust myself, then what am I actually responsible for? Because responsibility is one of those words that means very different things to different people. For some people, it feels empowering. But for others, it feels heavy, like pressure or blame, like carrying the weight of everything that has ever happened to them. And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings around responsibility, because responsibility is not the same thing as fault. I think that's important to say first, because for a lot of people, the moment they hear the word responsibility, their nervous system immediately hears, "This is all my fault." They brace themselves, they prepare to be blamed, or they start blaming themselves before anyone else has the chance. But that's not what I'm talking about here. You are not responsible for everything that happened to you. You are not responsible for the family you were born into, the environment you grew up in, the experiences that shaped your nervous system, the people who hurt you, the things you didn't choose. But you are responsible for what you do with those experiences now. That's a very different conversation. When I think about responsibility, I don't think about blame. I think about response, the ability to respond, to pause between what happened and what you choose to do next. And that pause can change the direction of your entire life. And maybe that's why this idea feels so freeing, because it shifts the conversation away from who should I blame and toward what kind of person do I want to be now. And that's a completely different place to make decisions from, because without that pause, we we tend to live automatically. Someone criticizes us and we immediately become defensive. Someone pulls away and we immediately start chasing. Something feels uncertain and we immediately seek reassurance. We react. Not because we're bad people, but because our nervous system is trying to protect us. And most of the time, it isn't choosing that reaction consciously. It's simply repeating something that once helped us survive. That's what nervous systems do. They repeat what has felt the safest before, even if it no longer serves us today. And sometimes protection is useful, but sometimes the strategies that once protected us keeps us stuck. For example, imagine someone grows up in a home where conflict always led to disconnection. Maybe arguments ended with silence, withdrawal, punishment, or just emotional distance. It makes sense that as an adult, their body learns to avoid conflict at all costs. You might even see it happening in real time. Their chest tightens, their stomach drops, their breathing changes. They start searching for the fastest way to make the tension disappear. Not because they're weak, but because their body has learned that conflict means danger. So they become agreeable. They try to keep the peace. They say yes when they mean no. They apologize quickly. They try to smooth everything over. Now, that adaptation isn't their fault. It was intelligent. They helped them survive the environment that they were in. But if they continue to live that way forever, they'll probably just keep abandoning themselves. And eventually, that does become their responsibility to notice. Not because they're to blame, but because now they're the ones living with the consequence. And maybe you've noticed something similar in your own life. Maybe you spent years asking yourself, why do I keep doing the same thing? Why do I keep ending up in the same patterns? Why do I keep making the same choices? Sometimes the answer isn't that you're incapable of change, it's that your nervous system has been faithfully repeating a strategy it once believed would keep you safe. And responsibility begins the moment you slowly start to notice that and choose a different response. And once you start to see those patterns, another trap also becomes easier to notice. And I think this distinction matters because so many people move between two extremes. It's either nothing is my responsibility or everything is my responsibility. And neither is particularly grounded because one gives away all of your agency and the other collapses under too much weight. Grounded responsibility lives somewhere in the middle, and you can actually feel the difference. Blame tends to feel collapsing. It's heavy, rigid, like your nervous system is turning against itself. But responsibility feels different. It often feels steadier, more open. It doesn't necessarily feel pleasant. Sometimes it still feels uncomfortable. Sometimes it still asks difficult things of you. But underneath that discomfort, there's usually a quiet sense of agency, a feeling that says, I may not control everything, but I still have choices. Not because the situation is easy or anything like that, but because you're asking a completely different question now. You're not asking whose fault is this, but instead you ask, how do I want to respond now? And that's a very empowering place to live from. I also think responsibility requires honesty, not perfection, but honesty. Because sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is admit that you're hurt or confused or scared. Sometimes responsibility looks like asking for help. Sometimes it looks like saying, I handled that poorly. Sometimes it looks like apologizing or walking away. Sometimes it looks like resting. And sometimes it looks like finally telling yourself the truth. For example, let's say maybe you've been staying in a relationship that hasn't felt right in a long time. Part of you already knows it, your body knows it, but you've been hoping it will change with time. So you're waiting, explaining away, trying harder, but nothing seems to be working. Now, responsibility might not mean blaming yourself for staying. It might simply mean becoming honest enough to admit that this isn't working anymore and allowing your next decision to reflect that truth. Or let's say maybe you've been unhappy in your work for years. Every Sunday evening, you notice your body becoming heavier. Monday mornings feel harder than they used to. You keep telling yourself, just get through another week. Now, responsibility doesn't necessarily mean quitting tomorrow. It might simply mean admitting something about this isn't working for me anymore. Because honesty almost always comes before change. Or maybe you've been waiting for motivation to change your life, waiting until you feel ready, until the fear disappears, waiting until you're completely certain. But responsibility might simply mean taking one small step anyway, sending the email, having the conversation, going for the walk, booking the appointment. Not because you suddenly feel confident now, but because you've decided to stop waiting for a feeling before taking action. And one of the things that I've noticed is that grounded people don't necessarily have easier lives. They still experience disappointment, grief, failure, uncertainty. They still get hurt. They still make mistakes. But the difference is they don't spend all their energy arguing with reality. They stop spending years wishing the past had been different or insisting that their life should have unfolded another way. Instead, they slowly start to ask, given that this is where I am right now, what's the next honest step I should take? And that changes everything. Think about someone learning to surf. They don't control the waves, they can't stop them from coming, but they can learn how to meet them, how to balance, how to adjust, how to recover when they fall. In fact, the more someone fights every wave, the more exhausted they become. Learning to surf isn't about controlling the ocean, it's about developing the capacity to meet it. And life works in a similar way. Responsibility isn't controlling every wave, it's learning how you want to meet the ones that arrive. So maybe a helpful question to sit with is, what have I been blaming myself for that was never actually mine? And right with that, what have I been avoiding ownership of because it felt too uncomfortable to face? Those two questions can tell you a lot about where your growth is asking to happen. So, if responsibility has always felt heavy to you, maybe it's because you've been carrying blame instead. Maybe you've been trying to hold yourself responsible for things that were never really yours to carry. What if responsibility isn't about punishment? What if it's about participation? About recognizing that while you don't control everything that happens, you still have a say in how you decide to move through it. Because responsibility isn't about becoming perfect, and it definitely isn't about carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's about staying present enough to respond instead of react, to choose instead of repeat, to stay connected to yourself even when life becomes difficult. Because every time you pause, every time you choose awareness over autopilot, every time you respond instead of simply repeating an old pattern, you're teaching your nervous system something new. You're teaching it that the past doesn't have to decide the future. And over time, those small moments of response become something bigger. They become your character, your direction, and ultimately the life you build.